Good evening, everybody. I'm Eric Holzenberg. I'm the director of the Grolier Club. This seems like this is the first evening. I'm gratified to see such a good crowd here tonight. It seems like this is the first evening when we're not in the middle of a parade or the opening of the UN General Assembly or anything else. And so I get the sense that people are able to move around the city, and I'm so grateful that some of you have decided to come here for the evening. This is the umpteenth hundred Rare Book School lecture. One of these takes place during every session, week-long session of Rare Book School. The Grolier Club is particularly happy to be hosting two classes this week. And we are extremely excited to have Elizabeth McHenry speak to you tonight. Elizabeth is Associate Professor of English at NYU. Elizabeth got her PhD in English in 1993 from Stanford University, her BA in 1987 in English from Columbia. Elizabeth, her work focuses on writers and the texts they produce, but she's also interested in recovering the history of readers and the context in which literary texts are distributed, received, and read. In her research and teaching, she's made wide use of local repositories of rare books and manuscripts, from NYU's own Fales collection to the New York Historical Society to the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She read texts by African American authors alongside works by European Americans to explore the critical dialogue between them. Her first book, Forgotten Readers, Recovering the Lost History of African American Literary Societies, published by Duke University Press in 2002, relied on a variety of theoretical and disciplinary lenses to understand the epistemological and social conditions of print culture and literary community for African Americans between 1830 and 1940. Her talk to you tonight is going to be focusing on some of these themes. It gives me great pleasure to present to you Elizabeth McHenry speaking on Making Negro Literature, Rethinking Literature's Workspaces and the Margins of Print Culture. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the Rare Book School and the Grolier Club especially, and to everybody who's been in class all day. Thank you for mustering up the energy to push on before the cocktail hour begins. So the work that I want to present to you tonight comes from my current project, which seeks to chronicle African American literary history at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. I came to look at this period to resolve the resounding silence that emanates from it. It's one of the most understudied and least understood moments in African American literary history. Historians have mined this interval for its political upheavals and rhetoric, documenting in particular the debates between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois for ideological leadership of the Black community. But literary scholars have by and large neglected it, maintaining their focus more comfortably on the easily recognizable authors, published works, and established publishing venues associated with the Harlem Renaissance, that cultural and social and artistic explosion that took place in the 1920s. Scholarly preoccupation with conventional markers of literary achievement, major writers and well-known works of fiction, have left the turn of the century largely unreadable, offering the false sense that this period was unremarkable in African American literary history. My aim in Making Negro Literature is to grapple more fully with this largely unmapped moment in African American literary history by considering a series of genres, institutions, personalities, and conditions of authorship and publication that allow us to reflect on the period's distinctive situations of literary engagement for African Americans. These literary situations, some successful, others failed or only partially achieved, offer a crucial lens through which to capture the unsettledness of literature as a category at the beginning of the 20th century, even in the minds of those working in the field. My argument in making Negro literature is that these turn-of-the-century stories are a distinctive piece of African American literary history that has been overlooked. Organized not around prominent names and major works, but around a set of now unfamiliar and critically undervalued intellectual workspaces, anthologies, bibliographies, editorial and ghostwriting work, unpublished writing, and short-lived periodicals among them. This history has effectively evaded our attention, making it impossible for us to recognize the kinds of questions that motivated the period's literary projects and their practitioners at the very moment a modern understanding of African American literature and criticism was taking shape. What was African American literature? How should it be defined and structured, and what were its proper parameters, practices, and objects of attention? How was authorship imagined and pursued? Through what venues would its writers come to be known, and how should its readership be organized and shaped? Here I'm building on a growing body of scholarship in African American print culture studies that attempts to complement, complicate, and challenge popular concepts about the ways in which African American literature has taken shape across the 19th and 20th centuries, in part by reconsidering received assumptions about what constitutes its relevant archives and objects of study. In the first chapter, I look at the understudy genre of the anthology, which were sold door to door to Black households, particularly in the South, by subscription publishers at the turn of the century. I argue that these were designed to replicate the architectural space of the 1895 Atlanta Exposition's Negro building, the first designated space on the fairgrounds of a World's Fair for the exhibition of Negro progress and achievements. In the years after the Atlanta World's Fair, when the bricks and mortar building that housed the Negro exhibit was emptied of its contents, literary anthologies became logical substitutes for that temporary exhibit, their textual forms offering the benefit of an exhibition with displays that did not have to be dismantled, but could enter people's homes on a permanent basis. Another chapter juxtaposes the authorship of two African American writers at the turn of the century, Booker T. Washington, who embraced the idea and impact of authorship and at the turn of the century published many, many books under his name that he did not write, and T. Thomas Fortune, whose career as an important African American journalist has been recognized, but his frustrations as an author of his own texts, especially works of fiction, largely overlooked. Here I look at the fiction of Washington's authorship, perpetuated, I argue, at the cost of Fortune's own literary career. Fortune served as Washington's ghostwriter, effectively authoring all but one of his major publications, as his own career as a writer languished. In another chapter, I take on a body of unpublished short stories by Mary Church Terrell, another political figure who believed that imaginative literature generally, and the short story specifically, had the potential to speak to the race problem, articulating the lives and struggles of African Americans in ways that nonfiction and journalism could not. Her story is distinctively about an aspect of literary history that rarely receives critical attention, that of failure. Her archives at the Library of Congress are full of short stories that she wrote and sought to have published by mainstream publishers like Harper's Magazine, as well as a dispiriting series of rejection letters demonstrating that the political climate in which she found herself was unsupportive of her literary ambitions. But her failure is not irrelevant. I explore the ways Terrell used her fictional writing to wage a campaign against the publishing industry that refused to publish the works of African Americans, a campaign waged not for her own benefit, but with an eye toward opening up these avenues of publication for Black writers in the future. As I hope you can see from this brief overview, the book's chapters are meant to serve as a variety of portals that provide entry into the literary atmosphere of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Perhaps the most unfamiliar portal that I travel through in this book is that of bibliography, and it is about bibliography that I will speak tonight. I should begin by saying that I, like many of you, began this project with a very limited interest in bibliography. Constructing one is, of course, the somewhat tedious chore that serves as a final stage in the completion of scholarly books and articles, and it's a form of citation that we repeatedly cajole our students to get right, especially in terms of its exact formatting. as a process of becoming scholars themselves. These are not the bibliographies which I'm interested in today. In this project, bibliographies emerged as one of the most interesting and historically important features of African American literary history, not because of what bibliographies are to us today, but because of their meaning for the generation that created them, for whom in the late 19th and early 20th century, these experimental knowledge structures became principal intellectual workspaces. I came to see bibliographies as subject of inquiry in their own right because of the bibliography that is included in one of the anthologies that I look at in the first chapter of my book. And the anthology is called Progress of a Race. Under the heading Colored Authors and Names of Publications, the bibliography in Progress of a Race includes 139 titles listed alphabetically by author. Some of the titles are written by clergy and have to do with Negro religion, such as the Reverend E.M. Brawley's The Negro Baptist Pulpit, or Reverend L.M. M.D.'s Haygood's The Colored Man in the M.E. Church, and the Reverend A.W. Pegg's Our Baptist Ministers and Schools. Also listed is the Reverend J. Harvey Anderson's Directory of the AME Zion Church and Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race by E.W. Blvd. But a clergyman, Bishop Arnett, was also the author of the essay Negro Literature, which appeared in the AME Church Review in 1890 and included its own list of noble examples of the race's literary achievements, insisting that the clergy was not only responsible for writing about religion. W.E.B. Du Bois's recently published The Suppression of the African Slave Trade in the United States of America, 1838 to 1870, was also included, as was the Afro-American Press and its editors by I. Garland Penn, who had served as the head commissioner for the Negro building at the Atlanta Exposition. All three of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies are listed, as are other texts pertaining to slavery, including William Still's The Underground Railroad and Reverend William Troy's Hairbreadth Escapes from Slavery. Several texts, like the Reverend C.S. Smith's Glimpses of Africa and Alexander Crummel's Africa and America and the Future of Africa, reinforced Progress of a Race's determination to acknowledge in print the African past of the nation's black people. The list also includes the celebrated black poet Phyllis Wheatley, and to her was attributed the title Memoirs of Poems, which anybody who knows Wheatley knows was not actually a title of any of her works. And the 19th century black writer William Wells Brown, whose The Black Man and the Negro in the Rebellion and The Rising Sun are included, but not the 1853 novel Clotel, for which he is most widely known today. Many of the black women writers whose literary accomplishments in the 1890s had earned them substantial recognition were included on this list, like Anna Julia Cooper's A Voice from the South, Victoria Earle Matthews' Aunt Linda, N.F. Moselle's The Work of African American Women, and Ida B. Wells's A Red Record. Although in an earlier chapter of the anthology called Personages of the Afro-American Race, Frances E.W. Harper had been highlighted as one of the many political activists or forerunners of liberty who should be included in any record of African American history, she is reintroduced in this bibliography as the author of 6 works of literature, including Iola Leroy or Shadows Uplifted, Book of Poems, Forest Leaves, and Miscellaneous Poems. Paul Laurence Dunbar, listed as Paul L. Dunbar, receives recognition as the author of Oak and Ivy, Poems, and Negro Love Song. The genre of biography also finds a place on the list, with titles like Richard Allen's Place in History and Honorable Frederick Douglass by J.M. Gregory. Finally, T. Thomas Fortune's Black and White, an analysis of racism as a systematic, institutionalized practice, published in 1884, is included, as is a collection of essays by William Krogman, the chief editor of the anthology Progress of a Race, in which the bibliography appears. Like most of the entries in the anthology, the list of colored authors and names of publication was not signed, and its authorship is unknown. Krogman was a professor of Latin and Greek at Atlanta University, but did he compile the bibliography? If so, what did he think would be the purpose of this list of colored authors and names of publication? How did he imagine that this collection of names and titles would be read and appreciated and put to use? In isolation, the list seems modest at best, appearing as it does in just over 6 pages tacked onto the very end of the chapter on personages of the Afro-American race. Its apparent insignificance accentuated by the heft of both the chapter itself and the book as a whole. One function of the bibliography was certainly the enumeration of titles by African American writers, which alone announced and documented the existence of colored authors and underscored the quantity of literature they had produced. Readers of Progress of a Race might have also used the bibliography to inform their own future reading. The list would point them towards texts by Black writers and about Black subjects that would supplement their understanding of African American history and literature. These uses alone would make the bibliography a crucial part of Progress of a Race and a significant aspect of this editor's effort to intervene in debates about Black progress and, by extension, the future of the Negro in the United States. But as a genre, bibliography is not simply about listing books or making reading guides. Bibliography is by definition an organizational, experimental genre, one used by its practitioners to assess, catalog, and characterize written texts in order to establish or declare the parameters of a literature and suggest means of its organization. It's a genre that is at once documentary but also generative, listing books in a particular order by a particular system, or undertaking particular categorical headings as a way of establishing a scaffolding of ideas. Bibliographers do not author traditional books, but they do author information or knowledge systems that form the basis of writing and rewriting narratives about different subjects and ideas. Bibliographies often form the basis for thinking critically about a subject. In this case, the subject was Black authorship in African American literature. One way of looking at Krogman's modest list of colored authors and names of publication is as a map, necessarily preliminary and in process, of the landscape of Black letters. As such, the list or bibliography is an attempt to establish the boundaries and contours of Black literature and authorship, and in doing so, to grapple with the very idea of literary production by African Americans and the very definition of African American literature. What should it include? What should be excluded, and how should the bibliography be titled and arranged? These questions do not formally introduce the colored authors and names of publications section of Progress of a Race, but they are inherent in the form of bibliography, a genre that, despite its seeming authority, also makes visible the instability or processes of development of a literary tradition. What is most important here is the very process in which the bibliographer necessarily engages. The bibliographies they create are exploratory documents. In the details of their composition, they attempt to frame the objects they include and the subject matter they address, asking and answering important questions as a way of making a larger argument. It's telling, then, that this period is littered with bibliographies. Read in isolation, these documents are important as print artifacts of African American authorship. But taken together, the key bibliographies published around the turn of the century emerge and cohere as modes of practical criticism. I want to begin to sketch this out for you tonight. A complete analysis of these bibliographies would begin with the list Works by Negro Authors, which is included in a report of the Bureau of Education in 1893. Of the 104 authors listed here, 14 are women. And while this bibliography consists mostly of monographs, it includes the genres of autobiography, biography, poetry, fiction, and history, as well as such ephemeral examples of Negro writing as conference proceedings and addresses. But tonight, let's begin in 1894, when Robert Mara Adger, a Philadelphia-based African-American post office employee and collector of rare books and pamphlets by and about Black people, put together a list of works in his own collection that he called A Portion of a Catalogue of Rare Books and Pamphlets upon Subjects Relating to the Past Condition of the Colored Race and the Slavery Agitation in this Country. As the title proclaimed, The authors represented on this list were not exclusively black. His interest was not in identifying Negro authors, but rather books having to do with black history and the history of education. The history of abolition. Born in 1837, Adger was deeply involved throughout his life in Philadelphia social, literary, and political organizations that fostered abolition and African American civil rights. As a member and then, after 1863, the president of the Banneker Institute, he had access to books and was accustomed to regular intellectual discussion and debate. His own desire was not just to see or read objects having to do with black history and culture, but to collect them. This seems to have grown out of the wealth of potential artifacts to which he was exposed. The list he compiled is alphabetized by title rather than author, and is notable for its variety in terms of both subject matter and format. Adger included books by black authors like William Wells Brown, The Black Man, and Joseph Thomas Wilson's The Black Phalanx. But these are the only authors that are included in both Adger's list and the list included in Progress of a Race in 1898. Adger's focus was on the variety of historical records of slavery and abolition. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Dread is included, but not Uncle Tom's Cabin, as were two popular abolitionist gift books, Autographs for Freedom and The Liberty Bell, both of which were edited by whites. The list also included objects made important by their association, like a title, A Discourse Before the Young Men's Colonization Society of Pennsylvania, delivered in 1834. Finally, the catalog also included a number of prints and visual images, including a sketch of Thomas Clarkson, fine steel engravings of John Brown, and a large painting of Frederick Douglass by Robert Douglass, Philadelphia, 1876. Now, there are many obvious differences between Adger's list and the bibliography included in Progress of a Race. First, the 1898 list of colored authors and names of publications records exclusively textual offerings. But most notable is that the list's interests in establishing specifically what should reside in a Negro collection. Whereas Adger's list included objects broadly associated with the black condition, the Progress of a Race bibliography is governed by its determination to compile a list of texts written exclusively by colored authors. It should be noted that Adger's catalog is limited to those texts which he had in his own possession, most likely collected over the years. Adger would ultimately sell or give away his collections and must be considered both as a collector and a dealer of rare books. But even with this caveat, Adger's bibliography marks a very different intellectual project than that of William Krogman, whose interest was in formulating the boundaries of black writing as both an emergent category of literature and as an embodied tradition of literary production. Daniel Murray's effort in 1900 to compile a preliminary list of books and pamphlets by Negro authors for the Paris Exposition and Library of Congress can be seen as in keeping with this project. As an assistant librarian at the Library of Congress, Murray was tasked with making a collection of books by Negro authors to form a part of the Negro exhibit at the Paris Exposition in 1900. After receiving the assignment, he spent 2 weeks preparing a list of 270 titles, which he then sent out with a cover letter requesting the cooperation of men of literary knowledge in several cities. And this is a quote from his letter. The Librarian of Congress, now Herbert Putnam, at the request of the Commissioned General, Ferdinand Peck, has undertaken to cooperate in the work of making a collection of books by Negro authors to form a part of the Negro exhibit at the Paris Exposition of 1900, and has detailed the undersigned to take charge of the same, he wrote. And he was clearly articulating his understanding of the importance of the display on the world stage for the development of black literature and intellectual history. He says, I need not dilate upon the importance of having such an exhibit at Paris and the value of such a collection to future investigators of the bibliography of Negro authorship. So Murray's request was both a plea for copies of the titles on the preliminary list that he sent out, as well as a public call for all interested parties to take responsibilities for its accuracy. The list was intended to be revised. Additions and corrections are desired, he wrote, emphasizing the collective nature of his endeavor. His individual requests included publicity tips that effectively recast them as public announcements intended to go beyond their immediate recipients, including to those who might have information or materials but not be able to afford to send them. He offered shipping labels free of charge. Additions to the bibliography, he instructed, outlining his own criteria for the list, should include the author, title, size, number of pages, date, and place of publication of every book and pamphlet, no matter how old, of which a colored man or woman is author. In addition to relying on the public, Murray also sent personal communications to distinguished bookmen such as Wilberforce Ames of the Lenox Library, later to become our own New York Public Library. By March of 1900, Eames had sent 54 titles that Murray added to his list. Murray's preliminary list of books and pamphlets by Negro authors is organized alphabetically by author, and its formatting includes 3 columns, one for the author, one for its title, and one for its place and date of publication. This last column is often left blank, and you'll see it's the column on the far right. It's often left blank, indicating that this information, although desirable, sometimes remained a mystery. This and other holes in the bibliography, coupled with Murray's general sense of the status of the bibliography, incomplete and constantly in need of revision, ever on the way to fulfilling his objective of one day composing a complete Negro bibliography, effectively underscores the way in which bibliography as a genre served as an important intellectual workspace at the turn of the century. Murray's bibliography was once again not just a list, but offered a scaffold on which to think about Negro authorship and what should be included as Negro literature. This bibliography included Ida D. Bailey's Atlanta Souvenir Cookbook, published in 1895, one of the many print relics from the Atlanta Exposition, but published in Washington, D.C., as well as Margaret Brown's French Cookbook or French Cookery Book, also published in Washington, D.C. in 1886. And I should add, compellingly described by the author in the preface of the cookery, the French cookery, as dictated by me and carefully written down by my friend, Louise A. Smith. These appeared alongside texts that remain well known to scholars of African American literary history, such as Linda Brent's Incidents of the Life of the Slave Girl, a text listed, you'll see, under the name of its fictional persona rather than its author, Harriet Jacobs, and whose publication date and location remained unknown to Murray at the time of the bibliography's publication. William Wells Brown's Clotel appeared on Murray's list, but in its final 1867 edition, which was published in Boston. Neither the novel's original publication as Clotel, and for those of you who are familiar, the titles are actually spelled differently, the original published in London in 1853, nor its repackaged 1864 version is listed. Interestingly, while Charles Chestnut is included as the author of the short story The Wife of His Youth, published in The Atlantic in 1898, and the story collection The Conjure Woman, published in 1899 by Houghton Mifflin, Murray identified neither text by date or place of publication. It's also interesting to note that Murray's 1900 bibliography adds to the corpus of African American literature a number of texts that we now consider as of crucial importance to both African American and American literature, broadly conceived, including David Walker's Appeal, Sojourner Truth's Narrative, and Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address. Equally interesting is his inclusion at the very end of the bibliography of 2 texts that he identifies as anonymously published. One is called Joshua, and the other is called 50 Years. There's an argument inherent in the decision to include these texts without knowing who exactly authored them, not only about the difficulty of recovering the African American past, particularly given its sparse traces and its erasure from the very sorts of documentary traditions in which Murray worked, but also about the necessity of doing so, even if it results in a record of African American history that remained incomplete. By the time of the Paris Exposition in May of 1900, the list had grown, and the books on display were celebrated as, and I quote, perhaps the most unique and striking part of the exhibition of American Negroes. There are many who have scarcely heard of a Negro book, much less read one, wrote W.E.B. Du Bois in proclaiming the importance of these texts. Here is a bibliography made by the Library of Congress containing 1,400 titles written by Negroes. 200 of these books are exhibited on the shelves. And I should just pause to say that you can see that the exhibit is a multimedia thing, and the book collection was along in the lower bookshelves, and above are posters and all sorts of other materials, media. It's worth noting that Du Bois's description of the exhibit of the American Negro literature includes Negro periodicals, 150 of which were on display in Paris. This is suggestive of his own thinking about the parameters of Negro literature, which in 1900 he also laid out in bibliographic form. Du Bois was a colleague of William Krogman's at Atlanta University from 1897 to 1910. He taught history and the then new discipline of sociology. One of his responsibilities was directing the Atlanta University Studies, a program inaugurated in 1896 by University President Horace Bumstead in an effort to study carefully and thoroughly certain definite aspects of the Negro problem. The Atlanta University Studies resulted in annual conferences and publications from 1896 to 1914. In all, three bibliographies were published in conjunction with the studies, one in 1900, one in 1901, and one in 1905. The first, a select bibliography of the American Negro for general readers, was published in 1900 as a part of the proceedings of the 5th Annual Conference. It is the shortest and corresponds to the publication date of Murray's bibliography for the Paris Exposition. Its title alone offers food for thought. Who were, in Du Bois's mind, the general readers toward whom the bibliography was aimed? The Atlanta University Studies were reviewed in many periodicals that would have primarily reached white readers, but more likely read by African Americans eager to learn about the advancements of their race. Du Bois's bibliography is quite informal. With few exceptions, entries are limited to authors' last names and titles of work, suggesting that the general reader interested in finding these books or placing them historically or chronologically would not need, or were able to track down for him or herself, the publication details of the volumes. What that general reader did need, Du Bois makes clear in the structure of his bibliography, was a list of pertinent titles that was broken up by specific focus as well as by genre. Du Bois divided the bibliography into sections, one on history, present social condition, biography, literature and art, and bibliography, methods of study, etc. The section on history is further divided into subsections that specify the various historical subjects that Black readers might wish to better understand, be it the history of the Negro generally, slave codes, the character of slavery, the economics of slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, or the history of Negro soldiers. The section on present social condition is a list of 20 numbered texts and is followed by a systematic breakdown of the text into various subjects. If readers were interested in books on health and mortality, they were directed to look at the following texts: 4, 6a, 7, 8, 10, and 18. Du Bois's recommended set of texts on amalgamation included number 1, which was the U.S. Census and included both the 1860 and 1890 reports, numbers 3, 6b, 10, and 16. Taken together, each of these numerical clusters represented Du Bois's effort to get Black Americans engaged with the sort of texts that would allow them to participate fully in discussions and debates about racial history, racial politics, and the future of African Americans in the U.S. These texts could be approached by subject matter, but they could also be approached through more general courses of reading, which Du Bois also lays out in the bibliography. One he called Short Course of Reading, which included 7 texts. The Longer Course of Reading, which, in addition to Williams' History of the Negro Race in America, included 11 other texts selected from across the Present Social Conditions section of the bibliography. As he had at the Paris Exposition, Du Bois featured periodical literature on his bibliography, underscoring his understanding of what he termed the permanent value of the endless number of discussions of the Negro in periodicals. Biography is its own section, apart from literature and art, which is a section that included the subsections of folklore, music, and literature. Finally, there are 3 titles in Du Bois's section on bibliography, methods of study, etc., a section which, at first glance, appears unremarkable, but, given the subject of my study, suggests Du Bois's own conviction of the importance of source documents for Black readers and warrants further inquiry. When considered in conjunction with Adger's collection of items relating to the past condition of the colored race from 1894, Progress of a Race's list of colored authors, 1898, and Murray's list of Negro authors, remember 1900, Du Bois's effort here falls into place as a part of a complicated imperative to sort through and order Black print culture, the category of Black authorship and Negro literature, and its relationship to Black history and other valued elements of culture. What becomes apparent here is the intellectual work that took place in the context of making a bibliography, not only on the part of the bibliographer, but also, by extension, by those who made use of the bibliographies themselves. By what text should African Americans be known? How was periodic literature related to biography, related to literature and art, related to bibliography? Should folklore be considered an art? And what, in African American contexts, was its relationship to other art forms like music or literature? Du Bois's 1900 bibliography offers no direct answers to these questions, and like the other bibliographies I've spoken of tonight, no narrative by which 21st century readers can definitively understand Du Bois's intentions as he compiled the bibliography. They are key structures of racial expression and intellectual work, though. In making visible how structures of knowledge and categories of thought were arranged, considered, and rearranged, these texts have much to tell us about how African American literature and authorship was being mapped, aesthetically imagined, and politically mobilized. But even as these bibliographies work to stabilize the definition, the possible efficacy, and the cultural currency of Negro literature and establish it as an identifiable historical category, they also point to the instability of African American literature at the turn of the century. What was it? How should its materials be categorized and arranged? It's worth noting that the intellectual work of making Negro literature that is visible in these bibliographies is mirrored in the larger unsettledness of literature as a category in the U.S. at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Institutional histories of the professionalization of literary studies tell us that, at this moment, the study of literature was consolidating as a formal practice, and English as a discipline was taking shape. The literary education provided by traditional colleges, where literary study was largely conceived of as an extension of grammar, rhetoric, and elocution, was giving way to the democratic, modern university's sense that literature itself could and should be organized and taught. But how? As pre-academic literary culture, think of drawing rooms, literary societies, clubs, public oratorical performance, gave way to academic literary culture, African Americans joined other intellectuals in the U.S. to imagine, develop, and debate particular scholarly and critical practices. At the heart of African American bibliographies are the same fundamental concerns being discussed and debated in a number of forums across the nation. What were the branches of knowledge that should be taken up? What were the parameters of literature and literary practice? How should literature be organized? What might a literary curriculum look like? And what vocabulary of terms should it use? How should a tradition of humanism and culture be considered and taught? What were the new branches of knowledge, and how should they be harmonized with the old? African American bibliographies frame and debate these questions, laying the groundwork for thinking critically about African American literature and making visible the participation of African Americans in ongoing conversations about the construction of literature as a category, the proper objects of its attention within the category of literature, and the value of literature and literary study. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, of course.
Elizabeth would be happy to take a few questions.
All of these bibliographies were published in such different sources. So Adger's, for instance, is literally a catalog. So essentially one copy, or perhaps a few that were distributed to potential buyers or collectors. And then Progress of a Race was an anthology which went through many printings over the years. And I actually haven't traced how far the bibliography is included in that, and the ways in which it is edited over the course of its reproduction. But the anthologies were distributed, they were published and distributed by subscription, making it, the subscription publishers in the end of the 19th century didn't keep great records of how many they made and where they were sold, and so the most general information I've really been able to get about the kinds of circulation that they had were from looking at various sales dummies, the volumes that the agents had worked off to sell. Literally editions of the book. They went door to door and signed people on. But it's really hard to know not only how many people read these, but also what they did with them. And I think that's that's the main question. That's what I've got to try and figure out how to get to, is what kinds of use the bibliographies went to. Because even the proceedings of the Atlanta University Studies, which we study now, it's really unclear how they were used then. And as I said, they were reviewed often in mainstream publications, but that doesn't suggest that they were read by, for instance, white readers. And it's unclear even the ways in which they were circulated to black readers. One interesting thing is that all these bibliographies, with the exception of Adger and probably Daniel Murray as well, so two of them, they are telltale of the ways that Southern black readers were and reading materials were taking shape at the turn of the century. And I feel like most of the evidence and materials we have on black readers ends up being primarily about readers in the North. So it adds, though not necessarily clarifies, to the mystery of how many and how African Americans at the turn of the century, where we know literacy rates were exploding in the South. But it adds to some sense of how this was all happening. And it also merges, the last thing I'll say is it merges also with the development of Carnegie libraries and Negro branches specifically of Carnegie libraries, which had their own reading lists as well. So it's unclear to me, and this is a big question, is were reading lists a genre that, of course, we would, theoretically, we don't read now, but is there a parallel with, I don't know, like the New York Times review of books, or a list of bestsellers, or in what way were these lists used? So anyway, I don't have a good answer, but it's definitely a great, it's like that's the meat and potatoes of trying to figure it out.
Okay. I actually have two. With Adger's catalog, was it priced?
Adger's catalog, it was sold to, the catalog that I worked off today was sold to Wesleyan University at the beginning of the 20th century. It was bought by a black family, a couple. It's under the name at Wesleyan of the wife, but it's unclear who was most interested and who bought it. I don't remember, but it's in the information how much it was purchased for. But one interesting thing is the catalog, the entire catalog, the entire collection went as one piece. So it was not divided up, though it's unclear of whether that was the buyer or the seller's insistence on that.
So it didn't have itemized prices, is
It
what I
did
mean.
not have itemized prices at all.
And I have another question. Was the early bibliographies, did they have the works of Emma Dunham Kelly in them?
Not that I remember, though. That's a good question. The one that I suspect did, and I'm just not remembering off, though I have a copy of it with me and we can look, is I suspect that Daniel Murray's did, the Library of Congress one. Du Bois's definitely did not. And in some sense, it seemed as if he was interested. His section on literature was minimal at best, and it was really his section on social conditions, what he called social conditions, that was so large. And you see, actually, oh, sorry. But this is the section on literature. It's just this right-hand side right here, and it's not even the full page. And this is the section on conditions, and it goes the page before. So you can see that the literature like that text, or like that author, wasn't really his focus, but it was certainly the focus of Daniel Murray, who wanted it all.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about the global aspect of what you've presented. Mm-hmm. So you're dealing with Du Bois, who has a very strong education in Germany, mm-hmm. Booker T. Washington also in German colonies in Togo, and you're presenting these reading lists at the Paris exhibition. And I'm sort of wondering whether you have any idea of reception of creating this type of reading list for general readers or for Black readers in other parts of the world at all. Yeah.
Well, I mean, as you know, one of the most fascinating things when you're like teaching Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, one of the first things you grapple with students is that he was, his global vision, that he really imagined. He imagined a nation virtually of Black folk, and that certainly went beyond the borders of the United States. And what I think becomes most interesting after you reckon with that immense vision of Du Bois, is that vision was also part of like David Walker's Appeal in 1828, and that vision, that sort of that vision of a nation of Blacks, and certainly it's picked up in the Haitian Revolution, which is even earlier than that. So it's very interesting to see the extent to which that global vision is part of the vision of establishing Negro literature and establishing also like the history of African Americans. One thing I would say is that one of the most interesting things about the anthologies that I've been working with is the extent to which they are interested in specifically Africa. And it's an interesting moment because, of course, on the one hand, one might think that in the wake of slavery, that particularly while struggling for recognition as citizens, that African Americans would turn their backs on the history of Africa and be mostly concerned with establishing a future in America. But clearly, the importance of Africa and the importance of that like global connection of Black people was like of primary importance. I think that it's interesting, and it'd be interesting to go back and sort of figure out how people's educational paths fed into this. But like Daniel Murray doesn't seem to have the same sort of like his bibliography doesn't have the same sort of texture in terms of those global texts and that vision of the reach of Black peoples, and yet he did not travel to he also did not travel to Paris. Du Bois traveled to Paris, and I think he was a much more, I mean, literally he was an employee, not a literary person at the Library of Congress, and I think that was very much evident in the way he went about constructing the bibliography, but also the way he stayed, very much centered in the United States. And I think his list is much more centered in the United States in some sense. But I do think, there's a strain throughout not only the anthologies but also the bibliographies, at least amongst certain bibliographers of the reach of African American literature as including all sorts of texts on either Black history, widely conceived, and also Blackness generally. And so in some sense, when I talk about in some sense, it's artificial to talk about African American literature here because, in a very large way, as would Schomburg, who comes in the 1920s, a famous bibliographer, probably our most famous bibliographer. He was completely interested in Blackness, right, in categorizing Blackness, in intellectualizing Blackness, and how you think about Blackness, not as only a United States phenomenon. He was from Puerto Rico, but as a global phenomenon. So I think the roots of this are taking place right at I would argue that the roots of that vision that Schomburg, picks up on, are really taking place at the end of the 19th century.
If I may ask another question. I think it's implicit in what you just said about Schomburg, but I wondered if you began to see, as time went on, the difference between normative and prescriptive bibliographies, i.e., all Negroes should read these books if they want to understand what it means to be a Negro, and more, what shall we say, more descriptive bibliographies of what people were actually reading, because it's sort of part of the sociology of understanding bibliography, I think, especially on the margins, as you call it, because I've done this kind of work with Italian-American literature, is the difference between, Midwestern librarians who said, now you nice Italian immigrants, you should be reading, Dante and Boccaccio, and they list all the classic works, but in fact there was a whole popular literature that didn't make it onto those prescriptive lists, and which people largely didn't get in the libraries, they got at book stalls and book stands and the emerging bookstores. So it sounds like you're looking into this kind of sociology of how lists were put together.
Yeah,
Am I correct?
kind of. I have to say that literally, if you'd asked me even 2 years ago if I would ever think critically about bibliographies, I would have just, I wouldn't even have known what you were talking about. So I feel like for me, it's very new to start thinking about lists and their construction, and actually even the difference between a list that is, I don't know, popular as opposed to a list that's prescriptive in some sense. So I feel like I'm sort of feeling my way almost blind. And actually, there's relatively little written about bibliography from any perspective other than literally how to construct one, right, for your own work now. So I feel like I'm a little blind on this. I do think that once you get to something like the Carnegie Libraries, you're really helped out because they did work with real readers, and there are real records of, for instance, lending, and that doesn't necessarily mean that people were reading things, but the kinds of things, the kinds of texts that people are borrowing. And I also think that that on some level, these early bibliographies, and by that I mean between 1893 and 1905, that very narrow strip, they're so much feeling their way, and again, part of them is just trying to document the existence of this thing, right? That there are quantities of literature by Black people out there that I'm not sure that they're picking up on the nuances of the kinds of publication, and you see the kinds of things they miss. Where is, even in a bibliography on things about African Americans, Adgers, where is Uncle Tom's Cabin on that? And there are other glaring absences. But it seems to me that that what happens is that these bibliographies that are published first give way to much more local sources of book lists, and one of those is Du Bois published 2 newspapers before he started publishing The Crisis, before he became the editor of The Crisis, the NAACP's newspaper, which he began in 1910. He took over that. He left Atlanta University to go and work for The Crisis as the editor. But his 2 earlier newspapers One is called The Moon Illustrated Weekly, and the other is called Moon Illustrated Weekly, and I'm going to forget the name right now. But those newspapers are very interesting because they are obsessed with reading. They're obsessed with what is published literally in each and every periodical and its quality, and its, and it says things like, you've got to read this, or don't bother with this. And so I think that that familiar, I don't know, and sometimes it's the anonymous suggestions and the familiar suggestions, but that familiarity comes later in some sense.
Good evening, Professor McHenry. Thank you so much for your talk. And I read the bibliography first when I open a book, but it's just, I think, where all the meat is. So I think you're onto something really great. My question is about you as a member of the Black Professoriate, Booker T. Washington and Dr. Du Bois. Where do you fall? Washington or Du Bois? The
so
five
funny.
fingers of one hand or the talented 10?
Okay, well, let me take a step back from that big question, and say that everybody I think everybody in the academy has rules about the first rule I had was I was never going to work in two states. I can't remember. One was Florida and one was Texas, and my first job was at the University of Texas. So there you go. One of my rules as I came into this project, as I got closer and closer to it, because I knew I wanted to look at literature from the turn of the century, is I was not going to write about Booker T. Washington. I was clear about that. I didn't want to get into it. I didn't want to deal with it. It was not something I was going to do. And yet everything led to looking at Booker T. Washington, yes, particularly as an author. And so it's been really interesting for me to, first of all, get over my little phobia, and also to find this angle in some sense, to this story I didn't really want to tell. And, I think part of it is just the intimidation factor that so much has been written about Booker T. Washington on some level. But I think that that in a very real way that, we've kind of, in part because ideologically we moved on from Booker T. Washington and we decided that what he was saying wasn't really, that cool. I think we ignored a lot of nuances of his scholarship and a lot of nuances of his life and his leadership too. So it's been really refreshing for me, and actually it's been really rewarding to come back to him and to think about literally, what we know about Booker T. Washington is that he was not into reading and literacy, as opposed to his more famous, probably, or more popular now, colleague W.B. Du Bois, who of course believed in liberal arts education and stuff like that. So to come back to Washington and really grapple with how he did look at literature and authorship, and to really try and figure out that tension between the fact that he pursued authorship, and specifically of books, because he was already an author of articles and stuff in periodicals and stuff like that, but the way that he pursued authorship in books makes it very clear he understood the heft of authorship and the heft of books, and that he wanted part of that, and it was important for his leadership to have part of that. And so the way he went after that, largely through other people's writing, it's just been really fascinating. So I can't, I feel like W.B. Du Bois is one of the towering intellectuals of the 20th century, and I think one of the most important American intellectuals, period. And Booker T. Washington, I think, is a fascinating figure, particularly for the way he negotiated this really incredibly difficult time. What I didn't say at the beginning of my talk, which I probably should have, was remember that 1896 is when Plessy versus Ferguson happens, and so segregation is legalized. And so all this literature that I'm grappling with is really against the backdrop of some of the most, the ugliest years in U.S. race relations, and the most challenging time for trying to figure out, well, okay, how is it that we make this work? And so to be able to look at Booker T. Washington more critically, and to think about, or less critically and more critically, to be able to think about, the kinds of things, the kinds of strategies that he was using, the kind of cunning he used, has been really fun.
Thank you.